Hey everybody, welcome back. This is Billy with Wolf River Music Television. Thank you once again for joining us here on our channel. We're getting ready to jump right into episode number 3 of our Laurel Canyon miniseries. And today we're going to start from right where I'm standing at the Canyon Country Store to across the street to the Kirkwood Bowl. And look, we're already here. Okay, so we're gonna head straight up this hill right here and into the Kirkwood Bowl area of the canyon, and we're gonna stop and look at some places that are connected to Don Henley and Glenn Frey of the Eagles. We're going to talk about Graham Parsons. We're going to find out a little bit about how he actually felt about the Eagles. We're going to stop at a place where Neil Young used to live. We're going to try to find the exact building that he used to refer to as the Shack. And we're going to talk about some other crazy, unbelievable stories that are connected to that same property. Because around here, sometimes truth is stranger than fiction. So stick around. This is going to be an awesome episode. We're approaching the house known as the Kirkwood Casino, notorious for its poker games, late night shenanigans, not only with the Eagles, but a lot of other people that were around during that time in the mid-70s. Strangely enough, a frequent visitor was actually known to be Joni Mitchell, which is very surprising to me because she doesn't strike me as the type that would be into the idea of late night poker games. But you know what? I've never met her. I have no idea. Okay, so I'm on Ridpath Drive right now, and back in the distance here would be the house that both Don Henley and Glenn Frey would share starting in 1974. You know, there's just so much that could be said about the Eagles, but there's just so little time. They've been around now in one way or another for over 50 years. And while they may have checked out a few times over the past few decades, they never really did leave. The music of the Eagles has been both loved and embraced over the years, but it's also been much maligned, even downright hated. And that of course begs the question, why? Some of it may be justified, some of it may not be. Some of it may be downright petty jealousy, but there could be a few reasons why there are certain people, and one in particular who I'm going to talk about in just a minute, absolutely despised them. He had a lot of very interesting things to say about them. Who am I talking about? I'm talking about Graham Parsons, who was considered the grandfather of country rock. And of course, as we know in the early days, the Eagles were definitely country rock. But any way you look at all of this, it could never be denied that they have somehow managed to become the biggest selling American rock band of all time. They have sold over 200 million albums worldwide since they began in 1971. So when Glenn Frey and Don Henley had moved into this house, it was 1974. So we're already past the big heyday of the mid-60s to the late 60s. So in a lot of ways, the Eagles were considered the new kids in town, and they were more the second wave of the successful groups that came out of Laurel Canyon. And boy, were they successful. I mean, they blew the roof off this place. And some of that could be responsible for the feelings of animosity that some people had towards them and their very quick rise to success. I mean, their first album had 3 top 10 hits. They were more than willing to play the music industry game to their advantage. And they were really good at it. You know, you got to give them credit for that. They played it, and they played it well. They knew what they were doing. But here's the thing. Glenn Frey has always been very outspoken and very unapologetic about the fact that his number one goal from the very beginning was commercial success. That's what he wanted, and that's what he went after. They all went after that. They were unified on that front. You know, there's a very good quote by Glenn Frey, and he says, "The Eagles were not pioneers. The Eagles were settlers." Now, there's more to that quote, and I'll share it with you here. But at least he's honest. You know, the big knock on the Eagles, especially Glenn Frey and Don Henley, since they were the undisputed leaders of that group and the founders, is that they took things from other bands. They watched very closely. They studied. They took from the Byrds. They took from Crosby, Stills, and Nash. They took the bass player from Poco twice. And they definitely took from Graham Parsons. And he made it very well known that he didn't appreciate it. Graham Parsons was more of a musical purist. The Eagles were commercially minded. And that rubbed him the wrong way for a lot of reasons. At one point, someone actually point blank just asked Graham Parsons, "What do you think about the Eagles' music?" And here's his quote: "The music of the Eagles sounds like a plastic, dry Now, I gotta be honest with you, I really don't know what Graham was trying to say, but it doesn't sound like a compliment to me. So let's just go ahead and segue right into Graham Parsons, since he seems to be so connected in one way or another to the music of the Eagles, whether it's his influence or just his opinion of them. He just wasn't down with it. He didn't like the fact that so much of his influence could be found in their music, and yet, you know, they were the ones that ended up going to sell 200 million albums worldwide. Of course, not in his lifetime. He was long gone before that ever happened. Graham Parsons, like I said earlier, has often been referred to as the grandfather of country rock. Now, later on, that morphed into what we now call alt-rock, or even just Americana. Now, he had a different name for it, though, while he was around. He called it cosmic American music. In the early days after his untimely death in 1973, you could hear that profound influence on a lot of major artists who were already established. I'm talking about artists that were as big as the Rolling Stones. I'm talking about the Grateful Dead, Johnny Cash, Emmylou Harris. These were some very big names, and they still are. And you can hear the influence of Graham Parsons all over that music. And like I had also mentioned too, this genre of music, which he's more or less credited for, that's kind of morphed now into the idea of alt-country Americana, well, that influence extended even into the 80s. You can hear Graham Parsons' influence in music from the Black Crowes to Wilco. You can hear it in Tom Petty. You can even hear it in REM, if you listen close enough. For all of this profound influence that Graham Parsons obviously had over his musical peers and contemporaries, the truth of the matter is, he had virtually no success at all, commercially speaking, while he was alive. He didn't have any hit songs. He was in several different bands, including the Byrds, the Flying Burrito Brothers. He played with Emmylou Harris. He even had a solo career. He was very prolific. And for the kind of life that he lived, I'm not really sure how he ever got anything done. He's the kind of artist that it's the classic legend that grew after his death. So Graham Parsons, in essence, could be considered much more successful now than he was even when he was alive. He was often described as a person who seemed to show virtually no interest at all in his own health or self-preservation. I mean, he lived fast and hard. He lived so fast and so hard that he didn't even make it to the 27 Club. He made it to the 26 Club, and that was it. He was done. So the legend of Graham Parsons and his music has only grown since his death. And his music has definitely lived on and endured the times. Graham Parsons was born Ingram Cecil Connor III, November 5th, 1946, in Winter Haven, Florida. He was raised in Waycross, Georgia, and unfortunately, there was a lot of sadness in his life. Both of his parents had clinical depression, and they were both alcoholics. Now, his father committed suicide 2 days before Christmas in 1958, and this was devastating to the very young Graham, who was only 12 years old at that time. It was in 1956, in Waycross, Georgia, when Graham was 9 years old, that he saw Elvis Presley in concert. And this left a lasting impression on him, so much so that by the age of 14, he was already a performing musician. After Graham had graduated high school, where he really was nothing more than just an average student, he somehow was admitted into Harvard with plans to study, of all things, theology. Well, this didn't last very long, because he got sidetracked very quickly. As a matter of fact, he only lasted a single semester at Harvard, and then he quit. This would have been in 1966, and it was during this time, while he was at Harvard, that he would go out at night with his friends in Boston and listen to music. Well, one night, he happened to hear Merle Haggard, and this was where his interest in country music began. So he and some of his musician friends got together and formed a band. They called themselves the International Submarine Band. In fact, it actually seemed like they were going to have some early success. And after a few various lineup changes, they decided to relocate to Los Angeles. They were signed by Lee Hazelwood of LHI Records. They recorded an album. It was called Safe at Home. Graham is 21 years old at this time, and the band didn't really achieve the success that they expected, and after about 18 months, it just more or less disintegrated. So the story goes that sometime, must have been late 1967, Graham Parsons was still in Los Angeles, and his band had broken up. Well, he met Chris Hillman, the bass player for the Byrds, in a bank lobby somewhere, and they struck up a conversation. There may have not been anything terribly significant about this conversation, but Chris Hillman by that time was a celebrity, especially around the Los Angeles area. And Graham Parsons probably most definitely knew exactly who he was. Now, Graham Parsons, on the other hand, not a celebrity. In fact, still a virtual unknown within the Los Angeles music scene. And it just so happens that during this same time period, the Byrds were going through massive changes within their ranks. David Crosby was gone, Gene Clark was gone, and the overall popularity of the Byrds was actually beginning to wane, so they were at a crossroads. They didn't exactly know which direction they wanted to go, but it seemed like they were open to suggestions. And so here it is, February of 1968. Chris Hillman remembers that a few months ago he had met a musician in a bank lobby somewhere in Los Angeles. He had his phone number, so they called him. Well, Graham Parsons comes over and auditions for the Byrds. Now, strange as it sounds, they actually hired him as a keyboard player, not a guitarist, not a singer, at least not at first. Now, we're not going to go any further into Graham Parsons' time spent with the Byrds in this episode. Why? Because in our other series, The Vinyl Review, when we get to the album Sweetheart of the Rodeo, we're going to go deep into that one. And we're probably going to spend 35 or 40 minutes just talking about that album alone. It was an incredibly important release. It was a commercial failure, but it was a very influential album, and it deserves its own episode for us to truly be able to give it the credit that it deserves. And so at this point, all I'm really going to do is just leave you with a very interesting quote that came directly from Graham Parsons, and he was speaking specifically about his very short time spent in the Byrds. And here's what he said, quote, "Being with the Byrds confused me a little. I couldn't find my place. I didn't have enough say-so. I really wasn't one of the Byrds. I was originally hired because they wanted a keyboard player, but I had experience being a frontman, and that came out immediately. And Roger McGuinn, being a very perceptive fellow, saw that it would help the act, and so he started sticking me out front." Unquote. So there's this crazy story that must have happened in 1969, because it was the time that the Rolling Stones were actually here in Los Angeles, and they were trying to record songs for their Let It Bleed album. Now, as I have stated earlier, Graham Parsons was friends with the Rolling Stones, especially Keith Richards. If you listen to the album Exile on Main Street, which is widely regarded as probably the Stones' finest album, you have to realize that that was being written at the time that Graham was in Europe hanging out with Keith Richards. You can even go back to the album Sticky Fingers and realize that the song Wild Horses was written at a time when Keith and Graham were hanging out very close to one another. At that time, Graham had founded the Flying Burrito Brothers. This was after his very short stint with the Byrds and the recording of the album Sweetheart of the Rodeo. Well, he had found out that Keith and the boys were in town, and so he wanted to go to the studio wherever they were in Hollywood and hang out. Well, Graham Parsons was also known for being a notoriously heavy drug user, drugs and alcohol. At some point during that session, Graham got overly inebriated and passed out in the middle of the floor in the studio. And this upset Mick Jagger and Keith Richards and the rest of the Stones, because they were busy trying to record an album. So somebody at the studio called Chris Hillman, who used to be the bass player for the Byrds, who was Graham's bandmate in the Flying Burrito Brothers, and just said, "Hey, somebody's got to come down here and get him out of here. We're busy and he's passed out on the floor." So Chris Hillman drove over to pick up Graham Parsons and take him away from the studio. When he got there, Graham was actually awake at that point and was being lectured by not only Mick Jagger but Keith Richards as well. Mick was telling him things like, you owe it to your fans to straighten yourself out. Get out there, get busy, get off the drugs, get off the booze, do what you need to do. Keith Richards, on the other hand, was mainly just concerned with Graham's overconsumption of alcohol and his drug habit. Now, I'm just going to go ahead and say this. If you've gotten to the point in your life where you're being lectured by Keith Richards on your overconsumption of drugs and alcohol, you got some serious issues in your life. Okay, so we're walking up to the intersection of Weepaway and Utica Drive, and we're about to turn this corner and head up to a property where back in the summer of 1967, the great Neil Young, who was still a member of the Buffalo Springfield, lived in a really small house up on a hill that he liked to refer to as the Shack. Now this one in particular has turned out to be a bit of a challenge for us for a few different reasons. One of those being that the house is no longer visible at all from down below at the base of the hill. And two, because I'm going to get sidetracked in a really big way. And I'm going to end up sharing a super long story with you that has almost nothing at all to do with Neil Young and everything to do with his landlord. But you're not going to want to miss this, trust me. Now I know that I mentioned in the very first episode that when I came out here for the first time to Laurel Canyon, I really only intended on just taking a few photos, putting them up on Facebook, Instagram, whatever, and then just calling it a day. But the more I read and the more that I looked into all these things that had transpired out here, the more I realized just how much more that there was to uncover and to learn about. Now this next story is a perfect example of me going down the rabbit hole and then coming back out with something that is really crazy. All right, so let's just jump right into this. And hang in there with me because it's going to get weird and complicated, but I promise it's going to circle back around and come right back to where we are now. On the morning of January 15th, 1947, the body of a young woman was found in the Leimert Park area of Los Angeles, which is just about 6.5 miles south of where we are right now. This murder eventually came to be known as the Black Dahlia murder, and the woman's name, after she was finally identified, was Elizabeth Short. Now, I'm not even going to begin to get into the grisly details of this murder because there's plenty of information out there to be found. So just Google it. Now, this is one of the most famous murder cases in Los Angeles history. Technically, never solved. And it wasn't even called the Black Dahlia murder until after the woman was identified. That was a nickname that she had been given while she was still alive because of her habit of wearing black clothing and also for wearing dahlia flowers in her hair. Now, this was also a play on the title of a 1946 movie known as The Blue Dahlia. Suffice it to say that this particular murder was so graphic and so horrific in nature that it was actually first known as the werewolf murder. Okay, now, stay in Los Angeles, but flash back to about 1940. In the late 1930s and the early 40s, there was a dashingly handsome young physician making good money and living in the Los Feliz area of East Hollywood. He had a tested IQ of 186 and had even once been considered a musical prodigy. Even Sergei Rachmaninoff had made a personal visit to hear this young man play while he still lived with his parents in Pasadena. This young man was named George Hodel. So smart and so gifted was he that George began college at the age of 15. But the young Mr. Hodel also had some very serious issues, and they began to show at a very early age. After just 1 year in college, he was kicked out for impregnating the wife of one of his professors. Now, as he got a bit older, his penchant for women began to accelerate at a very alarming rate. By his early 20s, he had a wife and he had a mistress. In fact, at some points in his life, he had multiple wives and even more multiple mistresses. Now, generally, we refer to folks like this as polygamists. Only Mr. Hodel was a polygamist, but without any of the religious trappings that generally seem to go hand in hand with those practices. George also liked the idea of other men's wives too. So, I think you're beginning to get the bigger picture here of who he was. Now, maybe it was a day in the age back then, but none of this really seemed to have any negative effects on his social standing in the high society circles that he ran in. George Hodel was wealthy, he liked to party, and he loved women. He was also obsessed with the darker side of the philosophies of surrealism. And he was a sadomasochist. He enjoyed inflicting pain on others. That was one of his side hobbies. So yeah, dude was sick AF. One of these lucky ladies within his harem at that time was a very young and a very attractive woman of a mixed European-Japanese heritage. Her name was Kayo. Now, her last name is not relevant at this point, but she did have many different married names during her lifetime. 6, to be exact. But we'll get to that part later. But for now, let's focus our attention on her for just a moment and come back to George later. And while we're at it, let's actually take a look at a photo of Kayo. And I want you to ask yourself a question. And by the way, yes, she is a very lovely young woman with beautiful eyes. So anyway, here's the question. How old do you think Kayo is in this photograph? What do you think? 21 maybe? Nope. How about mid to late 20s? No again. Okay, so maybe she just looks really young for her age. So what, 35 at the most? Keep guessing. She is 48 years old in this photo. Look again. This woman is 48 years old in this photo. So we can definitely assume that Kayo won the genetic lottery for eternal youth and beauty. It's unusual, but it's not unheard of. But the problem was that she didn't always use her superpowers for good. In fact, it seems like she more or less used them as a way to get the things she wanted in life, such as much younger male partners, even if it meant being totally dishonest. She did have a relationship with George Hodel, but hers was just one of many apparently. It lasted a couple of years, and then he grew tired of her and eventually just sent her on her way, and he eventually found another replacement for her. That's it. There's nothing else really to report about these two and the relationship that they had, which ended in 1942, other than a more bizarre kind of a connection that would manifest itself about 20 years after they went their separate ways. Only it wasn't between them necessarily. Okay, now stay with me, because this is about to get really complicated.